sensible instinct, felt drawn to that clarity. "I knew what I was signing up for," she would later say in one of her rare interviews during the early seasons of Mountain Men. "Tom never lied to me. He told me it would be hard. He told me it would be isolating. He told me I'd have to learn skills most women never need. And I said yes anyway." They married in 1973. Almost immediately, they began moving away from the world most people recognize as normal. At first, the isolation was partial: remote areas, limited contact, fewer conveniences. But with each move, they stepped farther from the safety nets people rarely notice until they disappear. Eventually, they settled in Montana's Yak River Valley, one of the most rugged and unforgiving regions in the lower 48 states. There was no electricity, no running water, no nearby neighbors. Medical care was hours away, on a good day. Winter temperatures dropped to 40 below zero, burying their cabin under feet of snow and cutting them off from the outside world for weeks at a time. This was not a romantic experiment. It was a permanent condition. Nancy learned fast, or she wouldn't survive. She learned how to tan hides, preserve meat, and maintain a cabin that faced brutal winters year after year. She learned how to manage fear quietly, the kind that comes from knowing a simple injury could turn fatal when help is far away. She learned how to be alone for days, sometimes weeks, when Tom traveled for supplies or seasonal work. But she also learned something rare: total partnership. Tom and Nancy were not just husband and wife. They were survival partners. Each depended on the other in ways that went far beyond emotional connection. When Tom injured his back so badly he couldn't stand upright, Nancy ran trap lines and carried the physical labor their lifestyle demanded. When Nancy fell ill with pneumonia during one brutal winter, Tom kept her alive with knowledge, vigilance, and sheer will. The cameras, when they eventually arrived, captured competence. They showed skill. They showed routine. What they couldn't fully capture was interdependence, the way neither of them could exist in that life alone. Their marriage was tested by conditions that would have destroyed most relationships. And in surviving those tests, it grew stronger. But strength came at a cost. Nancy slowly lost contact with family members who could not understand her choices. She surrendered the possibility of children, a sacrifice she rarely spoke about, but one Tom knew weighed on her more than she admitted. She gave up community, social connection, and the simple ease of belonging to something larger than two people and the wilderness around them. In his recorded message, Tom would later confront this truth directly. "Nancy gave up everything for me," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Her family. Her friends. Any kind of normal life. And she did it because I asked her to. Because I needed this life more than I needed anything else." For decades, he told himself it was okay. After all, she had chosen it. But knowing what you're choosing, and living with the consequences of that choice for 50 years, are not the same thing. And the weight of that realization would eventually become heavier than any winter the Yak Valley could deliver. For most of the world, Tom and Nancy all represented freedom in its purest form. Viewers saw a couple untouched by modern chaos, living simply, honestly, and on their own terms. To millions, their cabin in the Montana wilderness looked like an escape from everything that felt broken in modern life. But freedom, when chosen at the expense of everything else, carries a price that rarely shows on camera. For Nancy, that price was paid quietly. There were no dramatic arguments, no public breakdowns, and no moments caught by a production crew that hinted at regret. Her sacrifices were invisible because she made them look effortless. That was her strength, and also her burden. Years passed in a rhythm dictated by the seasons. Spring meant repair and preparation. Summer brought long days of labor. Fall demanded urgency, storing enough supplies to survive the winter. Winter itself was an exercise in endurance, patience, and silence. And silence, over time, became the heaviest weight of all. There were days when Nancy did not speak to another human being besides Tom. Weeks when the only sounds were the crackle of firewood, the wind tearing through the valley, and the occasional howl of wolves echoing across the mountains. For Tom, that silence felt like peace. For Nancy, it sometimes felt like disappearance. She missed conversation. She missed laughter that wasn't shared with the same person every day for decades. She missed being known by people who remembered who she was before the mountains claimed her life. Tom, in contrast, thrived in isolation. The wilderness gave him clarity. It sharpened his sense of purpose and reinforced his belief that modern society distracted people from what truly mattered. He saw their life as a victory over dependency, weakness, and artificial comfort. Nancy never fully disagreed. But she also never fully shared that certainty. What made her sacrifice heavier was that it was not demanded loudly. Tom never forced her to stay. He never raised his voice or issued ultimatums. His expectations were quiet, steady, and unchanging. Leaving would have meant breaking something sacred, something she had spent her entire adult life building. And so she stayed. The cameras arrived decades later, long after the hardest choices had already been made. By the time Mountain Men introduced Tom and Nancy to the world, they were already seasoned, skilled, and settled into their reality. Viewers saw confidence, not conflict. Mastery, not doubt. What they did not see were the years of learning through pain. They did not see Nancy crying alone after letters from home became less frequent, then stopped entirely. They did not see the moments when she wondered, quietly, guiltily, what her life might have looked like if she had chosen differently. If she had stayed closer to family. If she had lived somewhere with neighbors, doctors, and the simple comfort of community. Those thoughts never became accusations. They became secrets. And secrets have weight. As Tom aged, his body began to fail him in ways the wilderness does not forgive easily. Injuries accumulated. His legendary toughness no longer protected him from time. Tasks that once took hours began taking days. Strength gave way to strategy, and eventually to limitation. Nancy adapted again. She always did. She took on more responsibility, more physical strain, more emotional labor, while saying less about it. The balance of their partnership shifted quietly, and Tom noticed. For the first time, doubt entered his certainty. Had his dream required too much from the woman he loved? He began to see moments he had once ignored, the way Nancy hesitated before winter set in, the way her energy faded faster each year, the way she looked toward the valley as if listening for a life that no longer existed. The realization did not come all at once. It crept in slowly. And once it arrived, it refused to leave. Tom had always believed that choosing a hard life made people stronger. But now he wondered if strength had simply been demanded of Nancy because there was no alternative. Love, he began to understand, is not just about shared dreams. It is about shared costs. And the bill for theirs had been quietly accumulating for decades. By the time he was ready to acknowledge it, the question was no longer whether the price had been too high. The question was whether there was still time to do something about it. For most of his life, Tom Moore believed that endurance was the answer to everything. Pain could be worked through. Doubt could be ignored. Regret could be buried under responsibility. The wilderness had taught him that lesson early, and it had never failed him, until it did. The moment everything changed did not arrive with drama. It arrived quietly. One winter morning, the kind that settles heavy and gray over the Yak River Valley, Tom woke up unable to move without pain slicing through his spine. This wasn't the familiar soreness of age or labor. This was different. Sharp. Immediate. Unforgiving. Nancy saw it before he admitted it. She always did. That day, she took over without asking, splitting wood, hauling water, tending the cabin, preparing food. Tom sat near the fire, watching her move through tasks his body no longer allowed him to perform. For the first time, he wasn't measuring effort or efficiency. He was measuring cost. Every step she took carried the weight of years he had never fully accounted for. Every quiet breath she took reminded him of how much she had carried alone, emotionally and physically, without complaint. Later that night, when the fire burned low and the valley disappeared into darkness, Tom finally spoke the words he had been avoiding for decades. "I don't know how much longer I can do this," he said. Nancy didn't answer right away. She stared into the flames, her face unreadable. This was not new information to her. She had been living with that truth long before Tom had found the courage to say it out loud. What was new was what followed. "I don't want you to keep paying for my dream," Tom continued. His voice cracked, not from pain, but from realization. "You've already given more than I ever had the right to ask." The silence that followed was heavier than the winter outside. For years, Nancy had protected Tom from her doubts, just as he had protected himself from acknowledging her sacrifices. Now, the barrier between them had dissolved. She finally spoke. "I chose this life," she said carefully. "But choosing something doesn't mean it doesn't hurt." Those words changed everything. They were not an accusation. They were not regret. They were truth, simple, unembellished, and impossible to ignore. In that moment, Tom understood something he had missed for 50 years. Love was not proven by how much hardship you could endure together. It was proven by whether you were willing to change when endurance began to harm the person you loved most. The idea of leaving the mountains terrified him. This land was not just home. It was identity. Purpose. Proof that his life had meaning outside of modern systems he distrusted. Letting go felt like erasing himself. But watching Nancy age under the weight of isolation frightened him more. The cameras, present but distant, captured none of this conversation. Viewers would later see a subtle shift, a softer Tom, a quieter resolve, but they would never hear the words that set it in motion. Over the following months, small changes began to appear. Trips to town became more frequent. Tom spoke more openly about his limitations. Nancy's voice, once reserved and careful, grew firmer in discussions about their future. And then came the decision Tom never thought he would make. He suggested leaving the valley. Not forever, not yet, but enough to give Nancy access to doctors, people, and a world she had been cut off from for too long. The suggestion felt like betrayal, to the land, to his beliefs, to the life he had spent decades defending. Nancy didn't celebrate. She didn't rush him. She simply nodded. That response told Tom everything he needed to know. This was not about abandoning the wilderness. It was about choosing her. For the first time since they married, Tom wasn't asking Nancy to follow him into hardship. He was asking her to step out of it. And that choice, more than any winter, injury, or storm, would test the strength of their bond in ways neither of them could have prepared for. No one was supposed to hear it. The recording was never meant for television, never meant for fans, and never meant to become part of the Mountain Men legacy. It was a private message, raw, unfinished, and unbearably human. A confession made not for an audience, but for one woman. A love story wrapped in regret, responsibility, and truths that would shatter the image viewers thought they knew. The cabin in Montana's Yak River Valley had never felt so quiet. For decades, silence had been its companion, broken only by wind through pine trees, the crack of splitting wood, or the distant call of wildlife. But this silence was different. It was heavy. Final. Tom Orr sat alone at the handmade wooden table where he and Nancy had shared tens of thousands of meals. At 79 years old, his body carried the marks of a lifetime spent at the edge of civilization. His hands, scarred, thickened, and weather-beaten from tanning hides and shaping tools from raw materials, shook slightly as he adjusted the camera his daughter had set up at his request. "I don't know how to start this," he said quietly. His voice cracked, not from fear, but from something far more dangerous for a man like Tom Orr, honesty. "I've faced grizzly bears. I've survived winters that would kill most men. I've lived through injuries that should have ended me. But finding the words for Nancy, that's harder than any of it." This was not the Tom audiences knew. For 8 seasons of Mountain Men, he had been the embodiment of self-reliance. The stoic woodsman. The man who chose isolation not because he had to, but because he wanted to. He didn't cry. He didn't complain. He didn't ask for help. But the man sitting in front of the camera was not a television legend. He was a husband confronting his mortality. He paused, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand, clearly frustrated with himself. Tom was not supposed to break. Yet here he was, realizing that the life he and Nancy had built, far from roads, hospitals, and neighbors, was nearing its end. And there were things he could no longer afford to leave unsaid. Nancy's in the other room resting, he continued, his voice steadier but weighed down by something deeper than exhaustion. She doesn't know I'm doing this. She'd probably tell me I'm worrying for nothing. Tell me we've got years left. He shook his head slowly. But I know my body. And I know what the doctors aren't saying out loud. This recording would last nearly 40 minutes. It would never air on Mountain Men. It was too personal. Too devastating. Too honest about the cost of a lifestyle the show had long romanticized. Still, fragments of it would eventually surface through family members, revealing a side of Tom and Nancy's relationship that viewers had never been shown. What Tom recorded that day was not just a goodbye. It was a reckoning. A confession about choices made decades earlier. About sacrifices Nancy had carried in silence. About the quiet price she paid for loving a man who needed the wilderness more than he needed civilization. And once you heard it, you could never look at their story the same way again. For most of his life, Tom trusted one principle above all others: if you were strong enough, you could outlast anything. Cold. Pain. Loneliness. Time. The mountains rewarded toughness, and Tom had given them decades of it. He believed limits were excuses people made when they didn't want to push harder. But there comes a moment when reality doesn't argue. It announces itself. That moment arrived without warning, on a winter morning that looked no different from 1,000 others. The valley was still. The air was sharp. Tom tried to stand, and his body refused. The pain wasn't loud. It didn't knock him down. It was worse. It was final. Nancy watched him carefully, the way you watch something fragile without letting it know you're worried. She didn't ask if he was okay. She already knew the answer. Instead, she quietly absorbed the day, lifting, carrying, fixing, preparing, while Tom stayed still, forced into a role he had never accepted before. Observer. That was when the truth settled in. He wasn't afraid of getting older. He was afraid of what aging had already done to Nancy. For years, she had adjusted without announcing it. Taken on more. Rested less. Asked for nothing. Tom had mistaken her silence for effortlessly. Now, watching her move slower than she used to, he saw the cost written into her posture, her breath, her pauses. That night, the cabin felt heavier than the snow outside. Tom broke the quiet with a sentence that felt like betrayal, to himself, to the mountains, to everything he believed in. I can't keep pretending this isn't changing, he said. Nancy didn't respond immediately. She stared at the fire, its glow reflecting decades of memory. When she finally spoke, her voice wasn't emotional. It was honest. I know, she said. Those two words carried years of restraint. Tom continued, his confidence gone. This life was my dream. You lived it with me. But I don't know if it's right anymore, not like this. Nancy took a long breath. I never needed it to be easy, she said. I just needed it to be shared. That was the moment Tom understood the mistake he'd been making for half a century. He had shared the work. He hadn't always shared the weight. Leaving the wilderness, reducing it, softening it, changing it, felt like erasing the proof of who he was. The mountains were his legacy. Walking away felt like admitting that the life he preached might not be survivable forever. But love, he realized too late, isn't about proving something. It's about protecting someone. The idea of change crept in slowly. Not abandonment. Not surrender. Just adjustment. More time near town. Better access to help. Less isolation. Fewer winters that demanded everything and gave nothing back. When Tom finally voiced it aloud, he expected resistance. He didn't get any. Nancy nodded, not with relief, not with excitement, but with acceptance. as if she had been carrying that possibility quietly for years, waiting for him to arrive at it on his own. That nod hurt more than any argument ever could have. Because it meant she had been ready long before he was. For the first time since they had chosen the mountains, Tom wasn't asking Nancy to be strong. He was asking her to be safe. And that shift, subtle, terrifying, and irreversible, changed the meaning of everything they had built together. No one prepares you for the moment when the life you fought for becomes the life you have to loosen your grip on. For Tom, the mountains were never just a place. They were proof that a man could live honestly, rely on his hands, and reject a world he no longer trusted. Every tree he cut, every trail he walked, every winter he survived reinforced that belief. Letting go felt like betrayal. Not to the land. To himself. The decision wasn't announced. There was no dramatic declaration, no final walk through the valley with a sense of closure. Instead, the goodbye began in fragments, subtle, painful, and unfinished. Tom started storing tools instead of sharpening them. Nancy packed supplies with a different intention, not for survival, but for transition. The cabin, once alive with routine, began to feel like a memory that hadn't realized it was fading. Each object held weight. The worn table where they ate in silence. The stove that had kept them alive through winters that nearly broke them. The walls that had absorbed decades of conversations no one else would ever hear. Nancy moved through the space slowly, her hands lingering longer than necessary. She wasn't rushing. She was saying goodbye in a language only she could understand. Tom watched her, torn between relief and grief. Relief that she would no longer have to carry the full cost of isolation. Grief that the life he had asked her to live was ending because his body had finally drawn a line. What hurt most was the absence of anger. There were no arguments to justify the pain. No resentment to give shape to regret. Just acceptance, quiet, mature, and devastating. For years, Tom had believed that love meant standing firm. That commitment meant refusing to bend. Now he understood something harder. Sometimes love means stepping away from the thing you love most. Nancy never framed the change as escape. She didn't speak about freedom or relief. When asked, she said only that it was time. Time, for warmth, for ease, for being closer to help when help was needed. Time, for a different kind of living. As they spent more days closer to town, Tom felt the unfamiliar weight of people, noise, and convenience. He had spent a lifetime rejecting these things, and now they surrounded him. The contrast was unsettling. The silence he once craved was gone, replaced by conversations, traffic, and the awareness of other lives moving alongside his own. And yet, something else changed too. Nancy smiled more. Not broadly. Not dramatically. But often. She spoke more. Laughed more easily. Her shoulders relaxed in a way Tom hadn't noticed was missing. These were small changes, easy to dismiss, impossible to ignore. Each smile confirmed what Tom already knew. This was the right decision. Even if it hurt. The mountains remain part of them. They always would. No move could erase the skills they learned, the bond they forged, or the life they survived together. But that chapter, brutal, beautiful, and unrepeatable, had reached its natural end. The goodbye wasn't to the land. It was to the version of themselves that could live there forever. And as Tom stood on the edge of that